every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The year 1970 began in a state of profound cultural fracture. The United States was tearing at its own seams, deeply divided by the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and a counterculture that was rapidly losing its innocence. Just months prior, the Manson family murders had shattered the illusion of peace and love, replacing the flower child archetype with something far more sinister in the American imagination. The fear of the drug-addled, murderous hippie had permeated the national consciousness. It was against this backdrop, in the damp, freezing pre-dawn hours of February 17, 1970, that the military police at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, received an emergency dispatch. The call directed them to 544 Castle Drive, a modest, single-story brick apartment in the base housing complex. Inside, they found a scene of such absolute unrestrained butchery that seasoned military veterans were reduced to trembling. The victims were 26-year-old Colette MacDonald, who was 4 months pregnant, and her 2 young daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen. They had been bludgeoned and stabbed dozens of times. The word pig was scrawled in blood across the master bedroom headboard. The lone survivor was the husband and father, Captain Jeffrey MacDonald, a handsome, Ivy League-educated Green Beret physician. He was lying next to his wife alive, with a punctured lung and a concussion. Today, we dissect the anatomy of contested evidence. We will pull apart the narrative of a man who claims he fought off a Manson copycat cult, and contrast it with the microscopic forensic reality left behind in the blood, the fibers, and the silent layout of a crime scene. We will examine how a single piece of clothing can become a devastating witness, and how the interpretation of a bloodstain can mean the difference between life in prison and total exoneration. This is a story about the limitations of memory, the rigor of science, and the terrifying possibility that the most dangerous monsters are the ones we invite into our homes. To understand the sheer shock of this crime, we must first understand the life of Jeffrey and Colette MacDonald. They were the very picture of the American dream, a golden couple who seemed destined for greatness. They had been high school sweethearts in Patchogue, New York. Jeff was the charismatic, ambitious overachiever. He was the president of his class, the captain of the football team, and voted most popular. Colette was quiet, intelligent, and deeply devoted to him. When Colette became pregnant during Jeff's sophomore year at Princeton University, they married. Despite the challenges of a young family, Jeff's ambition never wavered. He gained acceptance to Northwestern University Medical School in Chicago. Colette worked to support them while raising their daughters. After earning his medical degree, Jeff joined the Army, eventually volunteering for the elite Special Forces. He earned his Green Beret, a symbol of ultimate physical and mental toughness. To the outside world, living on the sprawling military base at Fort Bragg, they were flawless. Jeff was a brilliant surgeon and a loving father who bought his girls ponies. Colette was a dedicated mother, taking evening college courses. But the physical reality of 544 Castle Drive on the morning of February 17th told a story of profound chaos. When military police arrived, they found the front door locked. They had to bypass a screen door at the back. Inside, the apartment was eerily quiet, save for the sound of Jeff MacDonald groaning in the master bedroom. The living room showed some signs of a struggle. A coffee table was knocked over on its edge. A flower pot was upright, but the plant inside had been uprooted. Several magazines were scattered on the floor, including an issue of Esquire that prominently featured a sprawling exposé on Charles Manson and the Tate LaBianca murders. The true horror, however, was confined to the bedrooms. In the master bedroom, Colette lay on her back on the floor. She had been bludgeoned repeatedly with a blunt instrument, her skull fractured. She had also been stabbed 21 times with an ice pick and 16 times with a knife. Her chest and neck were covered in wounds. A blue pajama top, later identified as belonging to Jeff, was draped over her chest. The word pig, written in Colette's blood, glared from the headboard above. Down the hall, 5-year-old Kimberly was found in her bed. She had been struck violently on the right side of her head, fracturing her skull, and stabbed multiple times in the neck with a knife. Her facial bones were shattered. Across the hall, in the room she shared with her sister, 2-year-old Kristen was found dead in her bed. She had been stabbed 33 times with a knife and 15 times with an ice pick. The sheer overkill was staggering, pointing to an attack fueled by immense, blinding rage. And then there was Captain MacDonald. He was lying adjacent to Colette, wearing only pajama bottoms. He had a localized bruise on his forehead, some superficial puncture wounds on his chest and abdomen, and a single stab wound between his ribs that had partially collapsed his right lung. Compared to the utter annihilation of his family, his injuries, while serious enough to require brief hospitalization, were miraculously survivable, and the pattern of those injuries would become its own exhibit. The punctures were shallow, uniform, and curiously parallel, none approaching any organ or vessel, and the Army pathologist who examined him privately noted that several could have been reached only by a right-handed person working on their own chest, observations that prosecutors would spend a decade trying to put before a jury. The defense read the same wounds as proof of a desperate, lucky survivor. He was rushed to Womack Army Hospital, leaving the military police to secure the scene. From his hospital bed, Jeff MacDonald offered his account of the night's events. He stated that he had stayed up late reading in the living room while Colette and the girls slept. Sometime after 2 in the morning, he heard Colette and Kimberly screaming. He claimed he rushed down the hallway, but was suddenly confronted by 4 intruders. There were 3 men, 2 white and 1 black, wearing Army-style field jackets. Standing behind them, illuminated by a flickering candle she was holding, was a white woman with long, stringy blonde hair. She was wearing a floppy hat and knee-high boots. MacDonald claimed the woman was chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." He said the men attacked him with a club and a blade. He fought back, using his pajama top, which had been pulled over his head in the scuffle, to parry the thrusts of the ice pick. He claimed he was eventually knocked unconscious in the hallway. When he awoke, the apartment was silent. He crawled from room to room, finding his family slaughtered. He said he pulled the knife from Colette's chest, threw it on the floor, and covered her with his torn pajama top before calling the operator for help. The story was sensational. It hit every cultural nerve of 1970. The idea of a Manzon-like cult roaming a secure military installation to slaughter a Green Beret's family created an atmosphere of absolute terror. The Military Criminal Investigation Division, or SID, immediately launched a massive dragnet. They looked for the woman in the floppy hat. They interrogated local drug users and counterculture figures in nearby Fayetteville. But as the days passed, the physical evidence at the crime scene began to speak, and it was telling a story completely at odds with MacDonald's narrative. To understand the subsequent investigation, we must look closely at the initial failures. The SID investigators were largely unaccustomed to handling complex, multi-victim domestic homicides. The crime scene at 544 Castle Drive was severely compromised in the first few hours. Dozens of military police officers, medics, and superior officers tramped through the apartment. A bloody footprint heading out the back door was destroyed. Fingerprints were smudged. The handling of the bodies was poorly documented. These early blunders would plague the case for decades, providing a perpetual foothold for the defense. Despite the chaotic crime scene management, the SID evidence technicians slowly began to piece together a forensic puzzle, and the first major discrepancy emerged in the living room, the site of MacDonald's alleged life-or-death struggle with 3 armed men. The damage to the room was strangely minimal. The coffee table was tipped over, but items that should have been crushed under it were resting neatly beside it. Dust on the furniture was largely undisturbed. A pair of MacDonald's reading glasses was found on the floor near the sofa. When examined closely, investigators found a tiny speck of blood on the lens. It was Colette's blood. If MacDonald was attacked while sleeping on the sofa, as he claimed, how did his wife's blood get on his glasses before he ever went down the hallway? Then came the blood spatter analysis. In 1970, forensic serology relied heavily on ABO blood typing. In a macabre coincidence that would prove crucial, the 4 members of the MacDonald family each had a different blood type. Colette was type A, Kimberly was type AB, Kristen was type O, Jeff was type B. This meant that the investigators could map the movement of each bleeding individual throughout the house by mapping the blood types. The blood trail did not align with MacDonald's story of an invasion. According to Jeff, he fought the intruders in the hallway and living room, receiving puncture wounds that bled, yet there was virtually no type B blood found in the hallway or the living room. There was a massive amount of Colette's blood in the master bedroom, where she died. But Colette's blood was also found on Kimberly's bed. Furthermore, a clear, bloody footprint made by a bare foot was found exiting Kristen's room. The blood was Colette's. The footprint, however, was not Colette's, nor did it belong to either child. For the defense, that print was the ghost of the 4th intruder walking out of the murder scene. For the prosecution, it became something even darker because an examiner who studied it testified that its size and characteristics were consistent with MacDonald's own left foot, which would mean the doctor himself had walked out of his daughter's room after stepping in his wife's blood. Both readings could not be true, and both were argued for the next 50 years. The weapons used in the attack were discovered just outside the back door of the apartment. There was an old hickory paring knife, an ice pick, and a heavy wooden club, which was determined to be a piece of a bed slat. All 3 weapons were traced back to the MacDonald household. The paring knife matched a set in the kitchen. The ice pick was identical to one Jeff had been seen using. The wood of the club perfectly matched the slats of Kimberly's bed. The idea that a roving cult had broken into a house without weapons serendipitously found 3 distinct killing implements inside, and then neatly discarded them all together at the back door seemed highly improbable to investigators. But the most damning piece of physical evidence, the absolute focal point of the prosecution's anatomical dissection of the case, was Jeffrey MacDonald's blue pajama top. MacDonald claimed he had wrapped the top around his hands to fend off thrusts from the ice pick during the struggle in the hallway, which is why it was torn and punctured. He then claimed he placed it over Colette's chest to keep her warm. When forensic technicians examined the pajama top, they found 48 small circular holes. They laid the torn garment flat and discovered that by folding it in a very specific way, sleeves tucked inward, and the body of the shirt folded over twice, all 48 holes aligned perfectly into a pattern of exactly 21 thrusts. This was the exact number of times Colette MacDonald had been stabbed with the ice pick. The odds that a garment torn in free-swinging combat would fold, by chance, into a perfect register of wounds inflicted on another person were presented to jurors as vanishingly small. The blood evidence deepened the argument because Colette's blood had soaked through the fabric in patterns, showing the shirt had lain flat against her body while she bled, not been thrown on afterward as a gesture of tenderness. The prosecution theorized that the pajama top was not used as a shield in the hallway at all. Instead, they argued that it was already draped on Colette's chest when she was repeatedly stabbed with the ice pick, the weapon piercing the folded fabric and driving into her body, and that MacDonald had then worn the torn shirt out of the bedroom as his own costume of survival. Furthermore, the fabric of the pajama top provided microscopic witnesses to the crime's progression. The blue cotton fibers from the torn shirt were found everywhere. They were found under Colette's body. They were found tangled in the bloody bedclothes of Kimberly's bed. They were found in Kristen's room. And crucially, a large clump of these blue fibers was found inside the master bedroom, right near where the struggle with Colette had occurred. Yet, MacDonald claimed his shirt was torn in the living room and hallway. The fibers tethered the tearing of the shirt to the bedrooms, not the living room. Despite the mounting forensic evidence, the military's case against MacDonald stalled. In the summer of 1970, the Army convened an Article 32 hearing, roughly equivalent to a grand jury proceeding. The presiding officer, Colonel Warren Rock, was highly critical of the SID's bungling of the crime scene. He found the military investigators' timeline confusing and their motive for MacDonald completely lacking. Why would a successful, seemingly happy doctor slaughter his entire family for no apparent reason? Furthermore, the defense aggressively pushed the Manson copycat theory, bringing in character witnesses to attest to Jeff's upstanding nature. Colonel Rock ultimately recommended that all charges against Captain MacDonald be dismissed, citing insufficient evidence. He also closed the hearing to the public and later destroyed his own notes, decisions that would feed suspicion on every side for decades. MacDonald was free. He received an honorable discharge from the Army, moved to Southern California, and took a lucrative position as an emergency room director at St. Mary Medical Center in Long Beach. He lived a flashy lifestyle, buying a condominium in Huntington Beach and a fast car. He even appeared on the Dick Cavett Show, cracking jokes and complaining about the military's incompetence, while displaying an emotional detachment regarding the murder of his family that struck many viewers as deeply unsettling. But the case was far from over, thanks to the relentless determination of one man. Alfred Cassab, known as Freddie, was Colette's stepfather. Initially, Cassab was MacDonald's fiercest defender. He believed Jeff's story completely and stood by him during the Article 32 hearing. But in the years following the dismissal of charges, Cassab's faith began to crack. He noticed Jeff's evasiveness, his reluctance to discuss the case, and his apparent lack of interest in finding the supposed killers. The turning point came when Cassab finally obtained and read the complete, thousands of pages long transcript of the Article 32 hearing. Cassab was a meticulous man, a former intelligence officer. He cross-referenced MacDonald's testimony with the forensic reports. He saw the discrepancies regarding the blood types, the fibers, and the weapons. He recreated the crime scene in his own mind and realized that MacDonald's story was a physical impossibility. Cassab turned from MacDonald's greatest ally into his most dangerous adversary. Cassab spent the next 4 years waging a tireless campaign against his son-in-law. He pressured the Justice Department, hounded congressmen, and kept the story alive in the press. He famously drafted a citizen's arrest warrant for MacDonald. His persistence finally paid off in 1974, when the Justice Department, prompted by Cassab's pressure and the compelling physical evidence compiled by SID investigator Peter Kearns, convened a federal grand jury in North Carolina. After months of testimony, Jeffrey MacDonald was indicted for the murders of his wife and daughters. The trial of Jeffrey MacDonald finally began in July 1979, nearly a decade after the murders. The prosecution, led by James Blackburn and Brian Murtaugh, presented a devastatingly clinical case. They did not focus on motive, they focused on the physical anatomy of the crime scene. They brought in a forensic scientist named Paul Stombaugh from the FBI laboratory. Stombaugh was the one who had meticulously reconstructed the folding of the pajama top. He demonstrated to the jury how the 48 holes matched the 21 ice pick wounds only when the shirt was folded, effectively destroying MacDonald's claim of using it as a defensive shield. The prosecution also demonstrated the absurdity of the weapon placement. They showed how the wood from the club matched Kimberly's bed slat. They highlighted the bloody footprint leaving Kristen's room, pointing out that MacDonald had Colette's blood on his feet, not his own. They argued that a domestic dispute had escalated into a horrific rage. They suggested that MacDonald, perhaps triggered by the crying of the children or a fight with Colette, snapped. After the initial violence, they argued, he meticulously staged the scene, using the Esquire magazine article about the Manson family as a blueprint to craft the story of the hippie cult, writing pig in blood and inflicting superficial wounds upon himself with a scalpel from his medical bag to make it look like he was a victim. The defense, led by Bernard Siegel, fought desperately to introduce the floppy hat killer theory. They had found a woman named Helena Stokely, a troubled drug addict and police informant who lived in Fayetteville at the time of the murders. Over the years, Stokely had made numerous contradictory statements to friends and police. Sometimes she claimed she was at the MacDonald home that night holding a candle. Other times she claimed she had no memory of the night due to massive drug consumption. The defense brought Stokely to the stand, hoping she would confess in front of the jury. Instead, she testified that she had taken mescaline that night and could not remember where she was, though she maintained she did not participate in the murders. The defense then tried to call witnesses who claimed Stokely had confessed to them out of court. The judge, Franklin Dupree, ruled this hearsay testimony inadmissible, arguing that Stokely was utterly unreliable and her supposed confessions lacked any corroborating physical evidence. Privately, Dupree also met with Stokely in his chambers to assess whether she might add anything under less pressure, and came away convinced she knew nothing reliable, a meeting whose existence would itself become a controversy. This ruling would become the central pillar of MacDonald's endless appeals. Stokely did not live to see the argument resolved. She died in 1983, at 33 years old, having spent her final years drifting between denial, half-memory, and the strange celebrity of being either a mass murderer or the most slandered addict in North Carolina. On August 29, 1979, the jury returned its verdict. They found Jeffrey MacDonald guilty of second-degree murder for the deaths of Colette and Kimberly, and guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Kristen, suggesting premeditation in the final killing to eliminate a witness or complete the staging. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms. The conviction, however, was merely the end of the beginning. The MacDonald case spawned a literary phenomenon that would redefine the true crime genre. During the trial, MacDonald had hired a journalist named Joe McGinnis to write a book about the case, expecting a story of an innocent man railroaded by the system. McGinnis had full access to the defense team, but as McGinnis sat through the trial and reviewed the evidence, he became convinced of MacDonald's guilt. The resulting book, Fatal Vision, was a massive bestseller. It portrayed MacDonald as a narcissistic sociopath who murdered his family in a fit of amphetamine-induced rage and then coldly calculated a cover-up. MacDonald subsequently sued McGuinness for fraud and breach of contract, resulting in a hung jury and a massive out-of-court settlement, reportedly in the neighborhood of $325,000, paid as the second jury deadlocked, and sparking endless debates about journalistic ethics. The fraud trial produced one of the most quoted sentences ever written about the profession when the journalist Janet Malcolm opened her two-part study of the dispute, later published as The Journalist and the Murderer, by observing that every journalist who is not too stupid or too full of himself to notice what he is doing knows that what he is doing is morally indefensible. Whatever else it accomplished, the MacDonald file had now generated the defining manifesto of skepticism about the people who write true crime, which is a strange kind of legacy for a book that helped invent the genre's modern form. For over 40 years, Jeffrey MacDonald has remained in federal prison, continuously proclaiming his innocence. His legal team has filed appeal after appeal, relentlessly attacking the forensic evidence and the exclusion of the Helena Stokely testimony. They have argued that the original SID investigation was so deeply flawed that no reliable conclusions could ever be drawn from the evidence. They pointed to lost skin samples from under Colette's fingernails and the destruction of the bloody footprint. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the advent of advanced DNA testing offered a glimmer of hope for MacDonald. The defense petitioned for the testing of trace evidence found at the crime scene, specifically hairs that did not microscopically match the MacDonald family. In 2006, the results were released. A hair found in Colette's hand was tested. It was Jeff MacDonald's. An animal hair found on Colette's body was tested. It matched the family dog. However, 3 hairs, one from under Colette's body, one from the master bedroom floor, and one from Kristen's fingernail, did not match the DNA of any MacDonald family member. The defense hailed this as definitive proof of the intruders. They argued that these unmatched hairs belonged to the hippie killers. The prosecution countered that the hairs were simply contamination from the chaotic, poorly secured crime scene of 1970, brought in by medics, police, or crime scene technicians. The courts ultimately sided with the prosecution, ruling that 3 unmatched hairs in a house heavily trafficked by outsiders after the murders did not outweigh the overwhelming totality of the physical evidence, the blood trails, and the pajama top that pointed directly to Jeffrey MacDonald. The appellate road behind that ruling was long enough to be its own case study in how American justice digests doubt. MacDonald first attacked the indictment itself, arguing that the 9-year gap between the Article 32 hearing and his arrest had trampled his right to a speedy trial. In 1982, the Supreme Court unanimously rejected that claim, holding that whatever delay occurred had not prejudiced his defense, a decision that quietly closed off the cleanest procedural exit from the conviction. Later petitions attacked the Stokely exclusion, the hair evidence, the lawyering at trial, and finally, the recollections of former Fayetteville figures who recanted old statements decades after the fact. Every one of them failed. Along the way, MacDonald's life acquired its own strange second act. In 2002, he married Catherine Carich, a psychiatrist who had corresponded with him for years and believed in his innocence without reservation, and she carried his case through filing after filing until her death in 2021. He remains incarcerated at a federal prison in Cumberland, Maryland, now an old man serving 3 consecutive life sentences, still giving interviews, still insisting that somewhere out there is a woman in a floppy hat who knows what happened at 544 Castle Drive. The anatomy of the MacDonald case is a study in the immovable object of physical evidence meeting the unstoppable force of a compelling narrative. Jeffrey MacDonald offered a story that terrified the nation, a story perfectly tailored to the anxieties of 1970, but the blood types mapped a different path through that quiet apartment. The folded blue fabric told a story of methodical stabbing rather than defensive blocking. The carefully chosen weapons spoke of familiarity, not a random invasion. The forensic reality meticulously dismantled the cinematic defense. And yet the anatomy keeps its honest asymmetry, because contested evidence cuts in more than one direction. The same chaotic crime scene that let the prosecution's fibers speak also destroyed the skin scrapings under Colette's fingernails. The one artifact that might have settled everything, and the same courtroom that admitted the pajama top demonstration, excluded the Army pathologist's darkest observations. This is why the case has never closed in the public mind, and why it matters beyond one family's tragedy. It teaches that evidence does not speak for itself. It is spoken for by investigators with limited skill, by judges drawing hearsay lines, by journalists with book contracts, and by partisans on both sides who know exactly which fragments to hold up to the light. We are left with the chilling realization that the most frightening monsters do not always wear floppy hats and chant in the darkness. Sometimes, the most profound evil resides behind the smiling face of an American success story, hiding in plain sight within the sanctuary of a locked home. And sometimes, less comfortably, the system that condemns him is so clumsy that 50 years later no one, not the families, not the courts, and not the readers of 100 books, can be entirely sure which of those sentences this story deserves. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.